Okay, AP Bio. Well, these slides aren't perfect, but we are now officially and formally, as we end the year in just a matter of just a few weeks or so, we are officially into anatomy and physiology. And so I would like to make that more formal, more technical, and more interesting. I got to tell you, gang, I wish we were together because this is the most fun that we have in AP Bio, and you would have really enjoyed anatomy, phys, medical history, and all the applications and cool stuff. I know that doesn't make you feel very good, but anyway, this entire lecture is 28 minutes. I will leave it up for about 3 or 4 days so you can use it for your attendance purposes and you can revisit it, retake it, no problem. So let's start with a definition of what anatomy actually is. The term anatomy just literally means to cut apart, to separate, and it is the study of structure. So that's what anatomy means, and that's what it is. It has nothing to do with chemistry, biochem, that's physiology. This is all about structure, shape, form, and function. And so this is the context in which we dissect when we do comparative anatomy. And that is a picture of an ancient operating table. You can imagine what a number of those tools are used for, especially the big ones. And keep in mind, they didn't have anesthesia. Anatomy first came about in the context of warfare. Um, there wasn't a lot of curiosity or exposure to anatomy in the medieval period. Really, anatomy came into its own when people were injured, and in order to fix something, you had to know where it goes and how it's supposed to work. And so the picture on the left was the most up-to-date picture before we get to a guy named Vesalius. The picture on the right is just a bad day at Founders, or you can call that midterms or finals, but that was basically all the injuries that could occur in the battlefield. So those images were what everyone was used to who were to practice anatomy, medicine, repair, if you will, until Vesalius comes along, and his pictures are next, and they are light years ahead of anything that anyone had ever seen, and it blew everyone away. Well before your time, it would have been like Star Wars when it came out in the 70s and Avatar when it came out in the early 2000s. So these are just a couple pictures of Vesalius. Note the landscape in the background to give just a sense of locality, context, and beauty. But then what he does is he goes through the human body layer by layer. That's why some of that looks like dripping. Every muscle has an origin and an insertion point, and so he cuts the origin and lets it hang from the insertion point so that you can see how it's shaped, how it works, and what it does. And these pictures are partly grotesque, partly beautiful, just amazing to understand. To appreciate. So, in anatomy and physiology, besides that, we get into a lot of things that you guys and gals have already been doing. I'm going to throw a couple labs at you. Don't get frustrated with these labs. Just do your best. Have fun. Something different than staring at a screen and reading a book. Don't stress out too much about them, but do your best to get me the data and experience the lab on your own, though it would have been more fun together. But we study variation between members of the same species or comparative biomimicry between different species. We can do metabolism stuff like calories and sleep, and then we can go into movement and study lactic acid formation, heart rate, blood pressure, and then like what a lot of y'all have been doing with your reaction times, we can study responsiveness, we can trick the senses, and I'll send you some of those labs for fun and do a great job, but don't let it be a source of frustration or stress. Thanks to Vesalius and thanks to old languages, we have a number of terms we have to learn. If you want to go pre-med, if you want to be an occupational therapist or a surgeon or anything like that, you're going to have to learn tons of terms. So superior is on top, which means the cranial for us. We're not a four-legged creature. We stand upright, so that's where our cranium is. Inferior is down below, or where a tail would be, but for us, that's our feet. Anterior is facing forward, but it's also where our belly faces because we stand upright. So our face and belly are in the same plane. And then posterior, which would be the butt, but for us it's dorsal because our back and butt face the same way. So we're a really unique creature and hard to study anatomically. There are more refined terms like medial means it moves towards the midline since we're a bilateral creature, or lateral to away from the midline to the edges, I guess. Intermediate is obvious, it's in between that. Proximal means close, distal means far away. So your elbow is proximal to your shoulder, but your knuckles are distal to your shoulder, but your knuckles are proximal to your wrist. And so these are types of words that we use to understand where an injury might be or where a body part is. And then superficial versus deep, the surface towards the interior. We can divide a body up abstractly into certain planes. So sometimes in anatomy, if we were together, of course, I would tell you to make a transverse cut or a sagittal cut, or look at the frontal lobe of the brain. I did have sheep brain for y'all to dissect. I don't know if there's any way to get those to you or let you do that. I might get creative and find a way, because I hate for them just to sit there and go to waste. But anyway, we use this with MRI, X-rays, and a number of procedures where we need to look at a certain plane or aspect of the human anatomy. The anatomical position, as you're seeing there with that guy, and in the next slide with this young lady, is feet facing forward, shoulder width apart, standing erect or upright, basically. And some people put both palms facing forward, and some people put one palm forward, one palm back, just so that you can see both sides of the arms. But that is the technical anatomical position that we use today, all derived from Vesalius, as you can see there in his more artistic rendering. Again, it looks grotesque, but it's absolutely amazing artwork. Those are not pictures, they're drawings. We've already covered this stuff early on with body plans and basically an intro to anatomy way back when, but creatures only fall into one of two types of symmetry. They are either radial, like some starfish and jellyfish, or they are bilateral, and that's what we are. We are a bilateral creature. We are cephalized, just like you see down below. And so this focus on anatomy and physiology, we are only going to focus on bilateral creatures that are cephalized. And to be even more specific, we are only going to focus on humans. This is not anatomy and phys of all creatures. We do comparative anatomy, like you would have probably dissected some squid I had left over, or a bullfrog. You could even do an earthworm, you could do a shark, we will study a sheep brain. These are all comparative in an attempt to understand a bit more about humans, but this is a human anatomy topic. From symmetry and the outside, we can go into the inside, and the reason we can go into the inside is because we're true coelomates, just like this earthworm. We've already covered this. But within anatomy and physiology, there are a number of body cavities. If you took an anatomy and physiology class, you would study everything from the sinus cavities inside your face. For those of you who get sick or have allergies, you're very aware of what that is. All the way to where the organs hang, to where the muscles go, tissue layers. We have taken the idea of being a coelomate to the nth degree. So... Within the history of anatomy, there are a lot of beautiful drawings from Vesalius to Da Vinci, from their journals to their diagrams to their artwork. So Da Vinci has drawings of cats and horses, and then he has drawings of human anatomy. He wants to do the geometry of a skull, and of course you get the Vitruvian Man. But anatomy has a rich history of artwork that is just breathtaking if you like this sort of thing. And it is amazing, the accuracy and the complexity of the human body as represented through art. Well, apart from anatomy is the study of physiology. Now, this is where nutrition comes in. This is where maybe development can come in. This is where, what else? You could do a type of therapy, a lot of debates, pharmaceuticals. And so physiology is not the study of form, it's not the study of shape, it's not the study of structure, it's the study of function. Now, form follows function, but it's specifically biochem, like I said, nutrition and pharmaceuticals, but you could do it all the way down to the cellular level, the chemistry that cells do in order to maintain homeostasis and stay alive, or you can come out to entire systems of the nervous and digestive and the respiratory, and you can do all that stuff, which we did a little bit of that in the previous chapter, and we'll do some physiology of the nervous system and even of the brain. So I just thought this was funny that the human brain is an amazing thing. In this chapter, we're going to study the nervous system. I'm going to send you some sleep surveys, some eating surveys, some stress surveys. You're going to hate and love these things, but I love this little graphic. You should laugh and also just kind of hate the reality of this, that our brains will shut down. They are not computers, and you are not a machine. You are a living creature. You can only take so much. So anyway, we'll play with that later. The first thing that you got to start off with is not the human brain, but a cone snail. You should have already watched a video on that. And the thing with the cone snail is that it has this really intense neurotoxin, this type of venom that it uses to stun its prey. It doesn't use the venom for defense. That venom is too expensive to make for inside itself, and it's too potent. It might sting you if you try and pick it up. It happened to a lady in Spain, but nevertheless, it's meant to kill its prey. And the reason is it could stab it with a harpoon, and that would stab it, but that prey, fish, for example, is going to put up a good fight. It uses a chemical. And the reason that's important for you is that your nervous system is electrical, but it is electrochemical. The electricity is generated through chemicals. And so what the cone snail does is uses chemicals to interrupt the electricity in another living organism. And so that's the point of the video. So neurons are like wires in the sense that they transfer information throughout the body, but they're not like wires because they're not copper wires. They are actual living cells that will use ions, chemistry, to conduct a signal, to communicate, to transfer information that your brain, for example, will have to coordinate and decode. And so that's where we're going in this chapter of how the nervous system works. And once you understand that it's an electrochemical system, I think you'll be more savvy and also more careful about what chemicals you introduce into your nervous system. So there's your PSA announcement on pharmaceuticals and illicit drugs. So don't do it, kids. Well, we're going to study first the form of the neurons, how they're built, what their anatomy is like, because form follows function. And so they have a really high surface area to volume ratio. Depending on the way they're structured together will be determined how they're used in the body. Some of them are as long as your leg, your upper thigh, and some of them are bunched together really tightly inside your cranium. And so you can take the same form but alter certain aspects of it and get different functions, which you'll see here in the next slide. There are basically only 3 types of neurons that you need to be concerned with. We will start with just a neuron, a standard one that has dendrites at the end where it receives information. It will have an axon where the cell body is, where it transmits a signal, and then it'll have these other branches at the end where it attaches to another nerve cell to transmit or give away its signal. So here in this picture you have a sensory neuron, an interneuron, like what's inside your brain, and then a motor neuron. And we would have a discussion about why in the motor neuron the black part is so branched out, where in the sensory neuron it's very small. And it has to do with receiving a signal versus sending one. And then if you look at the interneurons in the brain, they're all interwired. Well, the dendrites, those ones on the end, is where they receive info, chemicals basically, from another nerve cell. The axon is the long, slender, single strand where the cell body is, where it transmits the signal down, and then it's going to give that away. Now, none of your neurons are actually touching anywhere in your body. They're all separated just a little bit from each other. You could imagine if all of your nerves were completely connected, someone could tap you on the arm or you could bump your knee or something like that, and it would make every nerve fire. So thank goodness they're slightly separated. That separation is called a synapse. And that synapse is where the chemicals are used to go from one nerve cell to another. And in that synapse is where that cone snail's neurotoxin interrupts the signal. It doesn't really mess with the nerve cell. It just fills in that gap where one nerve cell would like to talk to another, but now it can't chemically. And so it would be like you and a friend being on opposite sides of a plate glass window and you can't hear each other. It blocks the signal. And so that fish is still very much alive, but it just can't move. It blocks the motor neurons. So it's pretty gross, the idea of being digested alive. The signal only moves in one, well, I was going to say one direction, but I hate saying that phrase. And so anyway, there you are. There's some definitions for you that I just mentioned. But the whole idea of an electrochemical system should start making you a bit more sensitive and clued in on how this works. So respect thy anatomy and physiology. All the nerves in your body conduct the exact same signal. It's just an electrical impulse. Your brain is the one, and this is the most fun topic that we could have in class. Your brain is the one that has to interpret these signals, and interpretation is a word that you can use for relationships, for learning, and yes, for senses. It's not so much that there's not a reality, but your brain has to interpret that reality. Your brain cannot see. Your brain cannot hear. It's locked up in a dark helmet inside, in your skull. And so it only receives electrical impulses, and it has to reconstruct these impulses into some type of VR, basically. It's the most complex form of VR that you've ever experienced. And so I don't know if you ever thought about that, but your brain doesn't actually see anything. It decodes electrical impulses and reconstructs them. To make a point of that, in this next image, you won't like this. It might hurt your eyes, but it's going to move. It's going to wiggle. And what that means is your brain is having a really hard time with the lines and the colors, figuring out which way this goes. Are you on the top looking down? Are you going through a tunnel? Are you falling into a bowl? And so your brain is having a hard time with the mathematics here. So this wiggling effect is, the image is not actually moving. It's your brain having a hard time with interpretation. I love it. It's really cool to notice this. If you want to see it again in the very next picture, if you're tired of looking at this, by the way, just close your eyes, or if it makes you kind of wonky, no big deal. But in the very next picture, you'll see a rainbow. And what I want you to do is stare at that rainbow for 30 seconds or for as long as this slide lasts. And when the slide switches, it's just going to be a white blank slide. You tell me if you still see the shadow of a rainbow. Well, you can't tell me. I wish we were together. I'm just in my teacher mode. But do you tell yourself if you can still see the shadow? And the reason is there's no rainbow there anymore. Your brain is just still interpreting the input that it was receiving. And so it's not expecting the rainbow to go away. And so it reconstructs the rainbow inside. So just stare at it for a minute. Do you see it? It may or may not work on the screen. If you saw it, cool. If not, you can replay or you can try it again later or whatever. It works great on my screen in the classroom. And so it's a lot of fun. I'm going to show you a few more images that'll kind of freak you out before we're finished. As a reminder, this whole lecture, I've only got 8 more minutes, 7 more minutes, and so you can play this over 2 or 3 times or as many times as you want for attendance. I'll leave it up for 4 days. You don't have to do it all at once, but this stuff is the most interesting. Well, when it comes to interpretation, there are a number of things that we can do to frustrate our brain as it tries to figure out what to do with the input it's receiving. There's a lot of these types of images, and your eyes and your brain will just go around and around to figure out where the top, where the bottom, where the side is. And I love this stuff because the fact that you'll go around and stare at this thing and just try to figure it out means that your brain has to do the reconstruction. And this is something that is not according to reality out here, and it is it is fighting with itself to figure this out. So this is the way I interpret a lot of relationships, a lot of friendships that I have. These images, for example, are just a bunch of pieces, but can you see the square inside the, say, 4 Pac-Man? There's no square there, but your brain finishes the geometry. Can you see scissors? There's no real scissors there. It's just pieces laid out, but your brain finishes it. And what is that on the bottom right? It's a deer, right? Or something like that, deer, antelope, whatever. But it's an animal. And so your brain will fill in the gaps. And we do this all the time in our interactions. People present us with a lot of gaps, and we fill them in. I'm hoping the gaps that we fill in are correct, but we have to make assumptions and biases and conclusions. And here's one image that is hilarious. That, of course, is Jake Gyllenhaal. If you look at the picture that's upside down first, it doesn't seem that weird because his teeth are in the proper orientation, and we don't really notice it in the picture that's upside down. The picture that's right side up is the exact same picture, but the curvature of the eyes and the teeth in the mouth do not fit what we expect to see. But when you flip the picture upside down, that fits with what we're expecting. And so I just think that's funny. The picture on the right looks stranger than the picture on the left, unless you start staring too hard. So I just enjoy freaking y'all out slightly and having some fun with you. This would be a point where we'd have a lot of good laughs in class. So all of this system, this nervous system, basically is a 3-step process. There's sensory input from the external world. That has to then send an electrical impulse to the brain. Your brain then has to integrate that into something meaningful that it can decode and use. And if there is going to be a response, it'll then have to direct a motor output. And so it's a 1, 2, 3 process for you to interact with the world. You've got to have good sensory input, your brain has to reconstruct it properly, and then your brain has to know what to do. So no wonder learning, relationships, physical athleticism, all of these are highly complex things to study and to understand. And so we start with that cone snail. It had the proboscis and the 2 eye stalks, and it's trying to smell the water and locate the motion of the fish. It coordinates those to target the fish and integration. And then finally it injects its harpoon with its neurotoxins through a motor output. And so I'm trying to kind of loop back through this stuff, and we're almost done here in just about 4 minutes. This is where you would have certain neurons that can taste the water and sense the motion, like sense light alteration in their sensory neurons. And then inside his ganglia, the inner neurons are coordinating all of that input to aim that harpoon and inject the venom. And then the motor neurons basically trigger the activity so that that snail can paralyze that fish and eat it. So if you understand each one of these, that there are sensory neurons in the senses, there are interneurons in the ganglia of that snail, and there's a motor neuron that fires that harpoon, you will understand that a neuron is just a neuron. It's got all three structures present in it, from dendrite, axon to synaptic junction. But you can alter the proportions of those and use them for completely different purposes. And that's where we're coming full circle. Just make sure you write these down, or you know this. And this is an image again of what I was trying to mention. Well, as we finish, the nervous system in complex creatures is extremely active, is extremely expensive, and burns up a lot of fuel. Your brain, I think, only makes up about 3 to 5% of your total body mass, but it uses 25% of your glucose in your bloodstream. It is a greedy, expensive, elaborate, complex system. And so neurons require a lot of support. And so what you'll see in this next picture is that you'll see neurons, and then you'll see these glial cells, these support cells. And what they do is they hold storages of sugar, they remove waste, they provide ions. And so for every neuron, there's probably a double or fivefold amount of glial cells that that support it, keep it clean, and keep it nourished. So in this next slide, know what a glial cell is, but in a mammal brain, which we would have dissected if we were together, the glial cells outnumber the actual neurons by 10 to 50 fold. And so in later discussions, we'll talk about what that means, why you have so many support cells. All right? Well, use this lecture for 2 or 3 or 4 days, however it works out for you. Take good notes, stick close to that book. I'll put up some concept check pods from time to time. But other than that, I'll do a part 2 and 3 and 4 maybe even. And so we'll take our time with this as we end the year. Take care, gang.